Hey, everybody, welcome back to the Michael Lofton Show on Reason and Theology. Hope y'all are doing well. I would like to respond to Dr. Feser, who on his blog yesterday responded to one of my videos about the magisterium, where I was addressing one of his articles with Catholic World Report about the suspended magisterium thesis that he was engaging or proposing in a very, very limited and qualified way. We'll talk more about that here in a moment. But I'm going to share my screen, and I got a PowerPoint for you because there's a lot of ground to cover. Dr. Feser responded with a blog that was about 5,100 words in length. And so there's like I said, a lot of ground to cover here. And so I figured it'd be easy to put it in a PowerPoint. So let's go ahead and begin. Feser and the suspended magisterium thesis. All right. So let me just give a few preliminary remarks. I'm certainly in debt to Dr. Feser's philosophical work. There is no dispute when it comes to that. Nothing can take away from that. Sorry, let me shift my screen just a little bit here. In fact, I'd say a whole generation of Catholics are in debt to Dr. Feser for his incredible contribution to the Catholic Church. So I just have to start out and emphasize that. Of course, I also want to thank Dr. Feser for interacting with my video on his blog and also helping me understand his position a little bit better. So in what follows, I am going to offer some examples where Dr. Feser has corrected me, where I spoke sloppily at one point in my response video, and in such instances where he has corrected me or where I've spoken poorly, I'm certainly going to offer an apology and assure him that I had no ill intent in the process. Sorry, trying to clear my throat here. I'll also examine cases where Dr. Feser has misrepresented me, and I'll correct him. I'll show where also Dr. Feser has not sufficiently accounted for some of my arguments against his position that he expressed in his Catholic World Report article. I'll also address Dr. Feser's defamatory remarks against me. And so, yeah, that's it. Let's buckle up. Let's get going. A lot of ground to cover. So, Feser's suspended magisterium article. In case you're not familiar with it, you haven't read it, Dr. Feser released an article entitled Cardinal Newman, Archbishop Fernandez, and the Suspended Magisterium Thesis on July 15th, 2023. Dr. Feser suggests the possibility of a temporary suspense of the teaching church. Now, he has some additional qualifications for it. He says this: the implications of these recent remarks that he had covered in the article, are accordingly quite dramatic. And while it's possible that the remarks will be clarified and qualified after Archbishop Fernandez takes office, the trend of Francis's pontificate is precisely one of avoiding the clarification and qualification of theologically problematic statements. But whereas in the past this avoidance pertained to a handful of specific issues, it now seems as if it is being raised to the level of the general DDF policy. If so, let us hope that this temporary suspense of the functions of the teaching church, that's the magisterium, does not last 60 years as the previous one did. St. John Henry Newman, pray for us. And so he's saying, in some instances in the past, there were instances where the church was not exercising its magisterial capacity in very, very limited cases. But he feels like it could be under Fernandez that's going to be expanded. Now, to what degree? Well, we're going to take a look at that. And that's partly what's in dispute. Now, after many requests from viewers of this show, from patrons, I responded to Dr. Feser's article, which was again found in Catholic World Report. I responded to that article here on Reason and Theology in a video on July 17th, 2023, in a video entitled Preparing for a Suspended Magisterium, Response to Dr. Ed Feser. In this video, I engage Feser's limited endorsement of the suspended magisterium thesis. And note that I say limited, because this is where there's a major point of contention. As we're going to see, he often misrepresents me as claiming that he holds to the suspended magisterium thesis generally and very broadly. And that is simply not the case. If one pays attention and goes, for instance, to the 50-minute, 26-second timestamp, I say this, quote, to entertain talk about suspense in the magisterium, a temporary suspense, I think is to prepare people to reject magisterial teachings, frankly. So I'm saying in some cases, and again, we'll talk about the broad scope of this, but I'm talking about what I think some people are doing in this talk of a suspended magisterium. And I'm saying in some cases, I think there are some people who are trying to entertain this to prepare people to reject certain magisterial teachings. Now, I say explicitly, I'm not. I don't know what his intentions are specifically. That is Feser. I don't know what his intentions are personally, so I'm not going to try to judge his intentions. I explicitly say, I am not judging Feser, his intentions for bringing up this suspended magisterium thesis, albeit it's limited in nature, but I don't know what his intentions are. I know that there are some others who are using this to prepare to dissent against the magisterium, and others who will exploit this conversation to prepare to reject magisterial teachings. But in Feser's case, I don't know, and I'm not going to judge his intentions. This is a big deal. Pay attention to this, because a lot is going to rest on this point. I don't know what his intentions are personally. That is Feser. So I'm not going to try to judge his intentions, but I'll just say this general talk of a temporary suspense of the magisterium, I think, is being used to a certain degree, at least by some people, notice I'm saying some, to prepare people to reject papal teaching authority through the Archbishop, that is Fernandez. So in other words, they're preparing people to reject something that the dicastery is going to be revealing, coming out with, or that Pope Francis is going to teach. And they can kind of use this, well, there's been a suspense of the magisterium per Newman, and so I could just ignore everything. Now, again, I'm very careful to note some people are probably going to do this and are preparing the groundwork for this. But I'm not saying Feser's one of those. I don't know his heart. I don't know his intentions, don't know his motivation. So I'm not going to impute him personally with that. But I want to mention this specifically, generally speaking, so that people have that on their radar, so that they're aware that there's going to be people who exploit this for that end. Not saying it's Feser. Feser very well may be well-intentioned, and people are still going to exploit this, regardless of what Feser intends. But again, notice that I say that explicitly. Why is this important? Well, Feser accuses me of libel. On July 21, 2023, Dr. Feser writes a 5,100-word article entitled Lofton's YouTube Strawman. In the section called Lofton's Libel, he says the following, quote, over the course of an hour, he, that is me, works through my article line by line, suggesting early on to his listeners that there is something weird or odd about it, and hinting darkly that it serves an agenda. We'll see more about that here in a moment. And what agenda is that? By the end of the video, it is finally revealed: to entertain talk about suspense in the magisterium. I think is to prepare people to reject magisterial teaching, to prepare people to reject papal teaching authority, to use it as an excuse to ignore the papal magisterium, the quote you just saw from me. To be sure, he immediately tries to cover his rear end. Notice the language there. Tries to cover his rear. by acknowledging that he doesn't know what Feser's intentions are specifically. But he insists that at least some people have this agenda and is left scratching his head about what exactly my own intentions could be. Now, here's the key: the obvious insinuation. Insinuation, pay attention. Especially given all the heavy going throughout the video about the weird, or how weird my article is that this is my agenda too, and that I am being cagey about it. Thus does Lofton fold my article into the hackneyed narrative of a dark army of boogeyman seeking by hook or crook to undermine Pope Francis. So he's saying, well, Lofton says that he's not judging Feser's intentions, but it's so obvious that Lofton is insinuating that this is really about me and my agenda, and I'm just being cagey or hidden about it. Now, I want to recap this. I explicitly say I am not judging Dr. Feser's intentions. I note others maintain the suspended magisterium thesis, and that it seems some may hold to this in order to dissent from the papal magisterium. Despite the expression of my own intentions made objectively known by my own words, when I said I don't know what his intentions are, that is Dr. Feser, Dr. Feser still assumes that he knows my real intentions. Despite my words, he knows my real intentions, and he imputes deception on my part and claims that I was speaking about him. Now, I just want to remind you from the Catechism 2478, to avoid rash judgment, everyone should be careful to interpret, insofar as possible, his neighbor's thoughts, words, and deeds in a favorable way. Every good Christian ought to be more ready to give a favorable interpretation to another statement than condemn it. Did Dr. Feser do that with me? No, quite the opposite. And it is upon this basis, the false assumption, despite my own words, that Dr. Feser attempts to read my heart, and then he explicitly accuses me of, quote, libel. Now, if you're not familiar with what libel is this: it's a published false statement that is damaging to a person's reputation, and it's specifically a written defamation. Libel is both immoral and subject to legal action. Okay, so he's using a term that is not only imputing immorality on my part, despite my own words, reads my own heart, tells me I'm lying, accuses me of libel, with, again, a term that is filled not only with moral connotations, but also legal connotations. Libel, however, specifically, is written, whereas my words were in a video, which means my claim, even if true, would not be libel, but actually would be slander. But that's a minor technicality. I'm more concerned about misjudging my intentions despite my own words, attempting to read my heart, but doing so falsely, and then accusing me not only of immorality, but of something that is subject to legal action. Now, in response to this article, I tweeted, Dr. Feser, thank you. Thanks, Dr. Feser. I'll soon respond to your claims, including your seemingly libelous claim that I engaged in libel against you. Because after all, if I did not commit libel, to publicly accuse me of libel seems like libel itself, because that certainly would damage my reputation. To accuse a Catholic scholar, a world-renowned Catholic scholar, for me to publicly accuse him, to defame him, that's a pretty big deal. And if in fact I was doing that, that could seriously harm my reputation. I'm sorry, that could harm his reputation. And but if I didn't do that, if I was not engaging in libel, if he was falsely accusing me, despite my own words, attempting to read my heart, but falsely accusing me, then his accusation itself, it seems libelous. It seems. Now, I said this to Dr. Feser. Here's what he says in response. The decent response would be, sorry, I misrepresented you. But I guess Feser libelously accused me of libel will make for better YouTube clickbait. You heard that right. Instead of actually Dr. Feser saying, hey, I'm sorry, I actually misrepresented you, he switches it around and says that I should have been the one to say, I'm sorry, I misrepresented you. And now we have a second accusation that he makes publicly, and that is that I merely said this to get more clicks on YouTube. I responded back, Dr. Feser, you falsely accused me of libel, and you want me to apologize for pointing out that such an act seems libelous on your part? I don't think you're thinking through this very well. Let's try that again. This seems a little backwards here. Dr. Feser responds and says, this is all, again, public information. This is all over Twitter that he's doing this. These are not private correspondence messages. This is public. So he's making these accusations publicly. He says, Guy makes defamatory comments. And when called on it, instead of issuing a retraction, tries to portray himself as a victim. So now we got another claim here. I'm just trying to portray myself as a victim. And then we got another claim. I think the psychologists have a label for this kind of thing, but I'm not a YouTube influencer. So what do I know? Somebody else asked me, well, Michael, why don't you just have Dr. Feser on the show? In fact, I was asked this by many people, and I'm so tired of answering that question. I've been answering that question for years now. And I mentioned to one person on Twitter, Dr. Feser has repeatedly declined to appear on my show for a discussion. The option is still open if he publicly apologizes for accusing me of libel. He sees the tweet and then he responds to it and says, by the way, the repeatedly declined business is, shall we say, misleading. Given that I had no idea I had even ever been invited in the first place. As I've said, I know little about this fellow beyond what I learned from having to waste time listening and responding to his defamatory video. So what's the insinuation now? Now the insinuation is that I'm, shall we say, misleading people in this question because he's never even heard of me. Well, people sometimes may not know, but I come with receipts. He said it publicly. All right. Well, you brought it into the public forum here by putting it into doubt. And I presented this as one among several declined invitations over the years. And I say, know that I come with receipts. And again, this is one of several. Somebody said, Michael, you just posted one. Yes, this is one of several. I just posted one. And it's Dr. Feser responding to me, hello, it's an interesting idea, but I'm pretty busy in the near future. And in any case, that's a topic I'd like to think through more thoroughly before commenting on it publicly. Best, EF. Okay, that's fine. I mean, look, he is not obligated to come on my show. That is perfectly fine. I'm cool with that. What I'm not okay with is telling people that I'm misleading people when I'm simply stating the facts. Facts that he could have verified very, very, very easily by just doing a quick search in his email. Or at least, if he doesn't recall who he has spoken to in email correspondence, just don't comment on it. Well, he continues to dig a hole for himself. Unlike Lofton, notice that, unlike Lofton, I'm happy to admit when I'm wrong. So now we got another accusation made against me that I'm just unwilling to admit when I'm wrong. So unlike Lofton, I'm happy to admit when I'm wrong. So it seems he did invite me. I had no memory of this, but then again, I get tons of emails, Twitter replies, blog comments from strangers that I reply to quickly and move on. So that's hardly responding. Hey, that's totally understandable. I mean, look, I get that too. I get hundreds a day. That I do not fault him for. I don't even remember who I've emailed in the last week. I totally get that. How is he going to remember? That's fine. But my point here is that, okay, well, if you don't recall, don't comment on this publicly until you have your facts straight, until you have your ducks in a row. I personally don't remember who I've emailed, but I would never come on Twitter and say that I think this is misleading. This is misleading. I've never even heard of this guy until now. I would never say that unless I went and verified my email and had my ducks in a row and made sure that I am not imputing deception on that person's part publicly, because that is defamation. What Dr. Feser is doing and has done is defamation. Make no mistake about it. And in his case, it's written, and therefore it's actually libel. Well, let's recap. All right, before we move forward into the nitty-gritty, let's just recap this. Despite my own words, expressing my own intentions, unless he has a soul reading machine, it's really hard to discern what a person's motives are. And so you kind of have to go with what they tell you. Despite my own words expressing my own intentions, Dr. Feser assumed I was being deceptive and that I was accusing him of presenting a limited version of the suspended magisterium thesis as a way to dissent from the magisterium. Upon basis of this false assumption, Dr. Feser accuses me of libel. I respond to Dr. Feser that his false accusation that I engaged in libel is ironically seemingly libellous itself. Now, my claim is true because the term libel has both moral and potentially legal consequences. If I did not accuse Feser of paving the way for dissent, and I did not, then his libel claim against me itself seems to be an act of defamation. Feser then accuses my correction of his claim about libel as clickbait. I'm just correcting him in saying this for clickbait. Note, this is another instance of Feser attempting to discern my motives, something I refuse to do to him. Ironically, he is repeatedly doing it to me. In this case, he suggests my motivation would be for money and or recognition. That's what clickbait is for. Now, Dr. Feser again accuses me of defamation and portraying myself as a victim, and then suggests I have a psychological disorder. Dr. Feser then says that I'm misleading people when I said that I have invited him on the show several times, but then he has declined each time. When confronted with the evidence that I've invited him on my show, Feser says that I am now unwilling to admit when I'm wrong. So just adding another accusation. Now let's see if we can discern a pattern here. I'm trying to find a pattern, a nice form, to use a philosophical term, in honor of Dr. Feser. A form in the ethereal, ideal realm. Is there a pattern to this? Well, I think I did discern a pattern. Dr. Feser makes a first false claim. I respond and note the claim is false. Dr. Feser does not retract the first false claim, but makes a second false claim in response. I respond and note the second claim is also false. Dr. Feser does not retract the previous false claim and makes a third false claim in response. I respond and note that the third claim is also false. Dr. Feser does not retract the previous false claim and makes a fourth false claim in response. I respond and note that the fourth claim is also false. Dr. Feser does not retract three of the false claims, but concedes that the fourth claim is false, but only after I provided irrefutable evidence, namely an email. Yet he then proceeds to make a fifth false claim in his response. I respond and note that the fifth false claim is also false. Where here's the formula, okay? I'm calling it Feser's formula, okay? If you hear me talk about in this presentation, Feser's formula, this is what I'm talking about. Here it is. Negatively judge someone's motives, initiate a defamatory claim based upon this judgment. So negatively judge someone's motives, say something that's defamatory based upon that judgment, refuse to correct the defamation when confronted, and then shift attention from the previous defamation claim by creating a new defamatory claim. And I noticed this Feser formula pattern employed at least five times. Actually, 6 times. I'm sorry. Because he does add a 6th false claim. All on Twitter. By the way, I haven't even got to his false claims in the article blog that he wrote in response to me. This is just on Twitter. On Twitter, Feser says, Lofton scrambles to do damage control. Not really. I was just taking screenshots of your stuff so I can just show this to people. If he's honest, notice that poisoning of the well language there. If he's honest, he'll apologize and retract rather than double down with his libelously accused me of libel nonsense. So if I don't retract my claim that he's seemingly engaging in libel against me, then I'm not honest. So per Feser, if I show that Feser falsely accused me of libel, then I'm not honest, which is now a new 6th accusation. And if I retract my claim that Feser falsely accused me of libel, then I would be lying to myself, as I know I was not judging Feser's motives. This option would also mean that I'm not honest. Somebody's saying the article is what's interesting. Refute those claims. Well, I have already explained to you that I am going to be getting to those, but we first have to get through this. Now, would this really be defamation anyway? Even if he was right about me, even if I was trying to say that he's preparing for dissent, would it actually really be defamation? Well, potentially yes, potentially no. Let's look at it. Feser's claim of libel rests on the assumption that I sought to defame him by demonstrating that he intends to sow dissent against the magisterium. Would this really be an act of defamation if it is shown that Feser himself admits to dissent against the magisterium? Let me give you an example. Suppose I said Feser worships a statue of Baal when this claim is not true. This could be an act of defamation. But what if Feser already admits to worshiping Baal publicly? Would me saying he worships Baal be an act of defamation? Not really, because it's then something that he admits to. Now, oddly enough, on July 18th, 2021, Dr. Feser seemingly implies, by way of analogy, that Pope Francis worshipped the idol Pachamama, though it has been conclusively shown that he neither worshipped the image, nor was it Pachamama. Is this libel on Feser's part? I don't know, but I am throwing that out just to consider. But I digress. Even if I did intend to imply that Feser intends to dissent from the magisterium in some instances, has Feser himself already admitted to dissenting against the magisterium in certain areas? On August 3rd, 2018, Feser wrote the following. However, on several issues, marriage and divorce, worthiness to receive Holy Communion, contraception, capital punishment, and more, Pope Francis has repeatedly made statements that appear to contradict traditional Catholic teaching and has persistently refused to respond to respectful requests for clarification made by members of the hierarchy and prominent theologians. Moreover, he has done so not only in offhand comments during interviews and the like, but in official magisterial documents such as Amoris Laetitia and now the Catechism, this is, to put it mildly, a highly unusual situation. He says, these are not normal times in the church. Okay. Now, I want to ask the question, in light of this, it's not clear to me, so I need to ask the question, does Feser submit to the magisterium of Pope Francis on the death penalty? It's not clear to me what the answer is there. I also want to say, does Feser submit to the magisterium of Pope Francis on Amoris Laetitia? Also, not clear to me from this comment. I don't know. I need clarification. If he withholds assent in these instances, does this mean that Feser committed libel against Feser? Because evidently for Feser, it would be libel for me to say that he dissents or is preparing the way for dissent. And yet, if he is withholding assent, would that not be Feser himself saying, hey, yeah, I dissent from the magisterium? So how is it really defamation to say that he's preparing the way to dissent for more magisterial teachings? Maybe it would be, maybe it won't be. I'd like more clarification, though. But let me be clear again. It is possible that Dr. Feser wrote his article with no intention of laying the ground for dissent, even if only partial. That's possible. It's also possible that Dr. Feser did write his article to lay the ground for dissent, even if only partial. Now, I've suspended judgment about Dr. Feser's motives from the moment I initially commented on the matter, as I explicitly said in my video. Currently, however, and even at that time, this hasn't changed, I opt for the first option. So I opt for the first option in order to give him the judgment of charity. So I lean towards the position that Dr. Feser did not write his article with the intention of laying ground for dissent. I lean to that to give him the judgment of charity. Even if I conclude he intends, however, to lay the ground for dissent, it is not clear to me that this would be an act of defamation in light of his comments about the magisterium elsewhere. However, it is very clear to me that, as I've demonstrated so far, what he has accused me of is defamatory in nature. Let's get to his article itself, now that that is out of the way. Let's talk about the content itself. He starts out the article by contrasting things that are expressed in articles versus videos. Dr. Feser begins his article by advocating for written interactions over video commentary. Now, I concede that written discussions have some pros. I wholeheartedly concede that. But you know, there's some areas in which video commentary actually has some advantages. With written format, one can take a look or take a little more time to think through a response. And that's a huge thing. I grant that. You got more time to prepare a response than video, which is more off the cuff. It's sloppy, especially if you do it every day for multiple hours a day like I do. You're bound to slip up and say something that you would have qualified more if you had the opportunity to kind of think through it more and write it down. I wholeheartedly grant that to Dr. Feser. However, with video, one can reach more people, given more people are likely to watch a video than read an article. I mean, that's my position there. I think that video reaches way more people than articles. Now, maybe you have some stats to show otherwise. I'm happy to stand corrected if I'm wrong on that. But Dr. Feser says a video response is likely to be considerably lower intellectual quality. Now, that's maybe going a little too far. I can grant it could be lower intellectual quality to an extent, but considerably lower, that depends. This should not be taken for granted. This claim of his should not be taken for granted. The claim depends on the person responding, who they are responding to, and how familiar they are with the topic. I mean, it's going to have all of those variables that are going to be at play. There's some people out there, no matter what they say, it's going to be low IQ. There's some people out there who are more competent to speak on some things than others. And so it just kind of depends on the subject and who they're responding to. Now, Dr. Feser also claims that videos require more time commitment compared to the written format. Now, you'll see in a moment why this is important. This isn't just nitpicking. This is also not necessarily the case. In my experience, I can generally cover a video response quicker than an article. For instance, Dr. Feser's 5,100 word written response to me required much more time for me to consider compared to, say, a 1 hour video that I play at 2 times speed. So I go through a 1 hour video in 30 minutes. And it's also convenient because I can work out or do the dishes or eat or whatever, or cook, and do that at the same time. Dr. Feser thinks section headings in a written response make things more accessible compared to videos. Now, I would note, maybe he's not aware of this, but I would note that YouTube chapter divisions, I know it's a fairly recent phenomenon. He might not be aware of this. The YouTube chapter divisions, and also the keyword search for transcript, by the way, in the transcript, YouTube chapter divisions serve the same function as chapter or section headings in an article, and they can be just as clear as, written section headings and chapter headings. It's the same thing. And so there's actually an advantage here with video because you do have the written transcript and you have video. Now, there's the disadvantage because it's a little bit more off the cuff. I grant that. Especially if a person does a video live and it's not pre-recorded. I do stuff live. So I don't edit. I don't film videos, pre-record and then edit and then post it. No, I do everything live. Everything you get is off the cuff for me. Unless I have a PowerPoint presentation. Dr. Feser asserts the hot take is going on here. He asserts that videos are typically made by amateurs. I thought that was an interesting comment. I note he nowhere substantiates this claim, but merely asserts it. That may or may not be true. He just asserts it. Doesn't really substantiate it. I'd also say that this may be a reflection of Dr. Feser operating with perhaps an antiquated impression of how public discourse is now conducted, even among the educated. I think that might be a little outdated. I'm under the impression that public discourse, even among the educated, is considerably shifting to video rather than articles. Maybe I'm wrong. But Dr. Feser bemoans the phenomenon of the hot take multiple times and accuses me of engaging in it. A hot take, by the way, is defined as a piece of commentary typically produced quickly in response to a recent event whose primary purpose is to attract attention. So it's not really to offer something meaningful. It's just more to attract attention, which, again, he accuses me of. But that shouldn't come as a shock because he had already accused me of just merely defending myself as for the purpose of clickbait. One may ask if some of Dr. Feser's responses on social media and also his own blog meet the definition of a hot take. I do think that is a question that we could ask. Let me give you an example. Archbishop Fernandez gave an interview to The Pillar on July 17, 2023, which utterly, in my opinion, destroyed Dr. Feser's main assumption in his suspended magisterium article. Dr. Feser responded to the interview on his blog the very next day. The very next day. Now remember the definition of a hot take, which he decries, is a commentary typically produced quickly in response to a recent event to attract attention. Was this an instance of hot take? Well, compare this to myself, who responded to Dr. Feser's article 2 days after it occurred, which is twice the amount of time that lapsed for Feser's response to Fernandez. So if I'm guilty of the hot take, does this mean that maybe Feser is guilty of the hot take? What does that mean about Feser? And this isn't the only instance, by the way. I just literally gave the most recent. My motives for offering the response to Dr. Feser, just to be clear, were not for a hot take or for clickbait, as he tells people publicly in an act of defamation. But as I noted in my video response to him, where I told people my motives, it's because many people, including Patreons, aggressively asked me to respond to him. Moreover, I, as a student of the magisterium, have a special interest in claims made about the magisterium by high-profile figures, especially ones that could be used to justify dissent against the magisterium, even if the author did not intend for people to use his content for that purpose. So I have an interest in responding to what Feser says, because even if Feser doesn't intend to lay the groundwork for dissent, and I'm taking him at his word on that, there will undoubtedly be people who will exploit his article for that end. Now, Dr. Feser may say, but they're doing so inconsistently. Okay, but that's not going to stop them. Concerning Lofton's libel, the section Lofton's libel. In the next section of the article, Dr. Feser says, I fancy, to use his term, myself as a, quote, upholder of Catholic orthodoxy, end quote. Well, I'll note that this is the job of every Christian to one degree or another. As Jude 1:3 says, Beloved, when I gave all diligence to write unto you of the common salvation, it was needful for me to write unto you and exhort you that you should earnestly contend for the faith, which was once delivered unto the saints. So I haven't fancied myself, or as he's going to say later, appoint myself as an upholder of Catholic orthodoxy. That's something that God has done for every Christian by virtue of our baptism. I'm also a professional Catholic apologist. This is what I do for a living, professionally, which means that this is one of my main duties. That is in part why patrons support me. That's a big reason why patrons support me. Thus, it is not an issue of what I fancy myself, but what I'm expected to do per scripture and per my job description, because that's kind of what I'm getting paid to do. Dr. Feser says my video response was quite bad, to use his words, in the way that YouTube hot takes tend to be, and also bad in a special way. He has a way with words. While I've noticed Feser often perceives public criticisms of his content in such a negative way, does Feser think his written blog response to my video is exempt from this criticism? Does he think his response to me is exempt from the criticism of quite bad, a hot take, and bad in a special way? It's a fair question. Fair question. Dr. Feser presents me as refusing to consider even the most measured and respectful criticisms of him, that is, of the Pope. He's saying that that is Feser, is saying that he will criticize in a very measured and respectful way Pope Francis. And he says that I refuse to consider even the most measured and respectful criticisms of Pope Francis. That's odd. Well, Feser's clearly not familiar with my work when he makes this claim, as he admits repeatedly. I'll note one seems to lack restraint when they must rush to a blog to comment about someone they don't know much about. Keep this in mind, because later on he accuses me of doing this very thing. And I have to point out, I think that this is something that applies to Feser. Clearly, he's rushing to talk about somebody who doesn't know anything about. Because, obviously, I don't have a problem with measured and respectful criticism of Pope Francis. I engage in that myself on this channel weekly if not daily. Moreover, when one is not familiar with their interlocutor, such as myself, it would be wise for them to tread carefully and avoid making such sweeping claims as Feser does here. Otherwise, they may walk away with egg on their face, such as when you tell a YouTuber that you won't even consider measured and respectful criticisms of Pope Francis, and yet that YouTuber engages in weekly, if not daily, measured and respectful criticism of Pope Francis. You might walk away with egg on your face. So it might be wise to tread carefully and not comment on a person you don't know much about. Dr. Feser also suggests that I'm opposing those who plead for nuance. I had to spit out my coffee at this point. As one commenter said in response to this, does he not know Michael's name, his middle name is Nuance? I'm kind of known for being the guy who employs theological nuance. I'm kind of known for that. Kind of have a reputation for it. It's kind of even on some of my merchandise. It's that much of a theme here on the channel. Ironically, if we're going to go the nuance route, if we're going to go there, since he decided to bring it up, ironically, I've demonstrated that I believe Dr. Feser's position on papal heresy appears to be severely lacking in nuance itself. And I demonstrated this in a video response to Dr. Feser called Dr. Edward Feser on Papal Infallibility, a Friendly Response, issued on December 21st, 2022 on this channel. So since we're talking about nuance, yeah, I need to point that one out. Dr. Feser suggests that I'm among the group of those who is tearing the church apart. That's a pretty serious claim. Okay. Well, I will certainly take this to prayer and reflect upon this accusation further. Sincerely. But Feser doesn't seem to consider if he himself falls within this criticism by some of his public positions. Next, in his video response, Dr. Feser accuses me of libel. And we've kind of already gone through that. This is the part in the article where he does it. Kind of went through that already at the beginning, so I'm not really going to treat it in any detail here. I'll just again recap. I've already demonstrated at the beginning of this video that is a false accusation, and the claim itself seems to fall into the category of libel itself. Moreover, even if Feser is right, my verbal comments in a video would not qualify as libel, but as potential slander, because there's a difference between libel and slander. And then only if the claim was not true. There is a question on would that claim actually even be true? Dr. Feser proceeds to accuse me at this point of offering a defamatory insinuation against him. And to this, I just say, see the same response that I gave to the libel claim above. Dr. Feser then mocks me as having the gift for packing 10 pounds of air into a 5-pound bag. As I said, he has a way with words. I will simply note that this is an ad hominem. And I'm pretty good at those if I wanted to. I don't engage in them very often. I could certainly return the favor, but I'm going to pass on that. Dr. Feser admits he loses his temper here and there in the article, and he apologized for it, suggesting that he's going to do that in this article against me. I'd recommend to Dr. Feser that if he is prone to this vice, that he avoid commenting on social media. That is my recommendation. Dr. Feser then says that he is wasting hours in responding to me with his response article, to which I'd recommend that if this is true, that he would be wise to make better use of his time in the future. After all, if I'm the things that Feser accuses me of, then he should ignore me. So why is he wasting time on me? Now, Dr. Feser accuses me of badly distorting his position in the CWR article. Now we're really getting into the meat of this stuff. And I'm going to show you where he's wrong. But this is kind of the meat, the bulk of his claim against me in his article. He accuses me of badly distorting his position in his Catholic World Report article. And in what follows in the rest of the article, he attempts to provide evidence to substantiate this claim, which he fails to do miserably, I might add. Dr. Feser says that I give the impression that he is sympathetic to the claim that some have made about a general suspense of the entire papal magisterium. So he's saying that I'm saying that he holds to this position that the entire magisterium has just ceased. It's more of a general suspense of the entire papal magisterium. It's not limited. It's just like the whole thing has ceased. Now, I want to apologize to Dr. Feser. If I gave that impression, please forgive me, Dr. Feser. I apologize for that. However, Dr. Feser, I explicitly said that Dr. Feser does not hold to this general suspense position at the 21-minute and 44-second timestamp. I explicitly say that. So if I gave that impression, people should know that that wasn't my position, since I explicitly said otherwise at the 21-minute and 44-second timestamp. Now, a quick keyword search of the transcript of the video would have shown this. However, to throw him a bone, I'll admit I do suggest Feser might, I use the word might, be asserting that Pope Francis's magisterium after Fernandez's appointment to the dicastery for the doctrine of the faith might be suspended. In my mind, there was a remote, not really a strong, but a remote possibility of this, given how absurd Dr. Feser's extremely limited position on the suspense of the magisterium of the dicastery for the doctrine of the faith actually is. In fact, it is so limited, that is Dr. Feser's position according to Dr. Feser. It is so limited, it is useless to even suggest, which I'll demonstrate later. Yet Dr. Feser says that is not his position. He says that. So I take Dr. Feser at his word, which ironically he refuses to do with me. I take Dr. Feser at his word, and I stand corrected on that point. Since he says he doesn't take that position, okay, I'll take him at his word. I apologize for being open to that and in any way suggesting that possibility even remotely. Now, Dr. Feser continues. He says, in the second half of my article, I suggest that the remarks made by Pope Francis and Archbishop Fernandez upon the Archbishop's appointment as prefect for the dicastery of the doctrine of the faith imply that the DDF specifically will to a large extent no longer exercise its traditional magisterial function. Lofton transforms this into the claim that the magisterium of the church in general will from here on out be suspended, something I never said and would not say. End quote. Incorrect. I said that if Dr. Feser is suggesting that the DDF's magisterium will be in suspense, then that is a useless claim because, especially if it's a partial suspense of the DDF, which is the position he's claiming, it's a useless claim to make. It's not common for the Pope to teach through the DDF, the dicastery for the doctrine of the faith, we're going to see a severe problem with something he says later on concerning that. Most papal and collegial teachings will still remain intact, which Feser concedes. He concedes that. But there is actually a problem, though he concedes that, there is a problem with something he said elsewhere. And I'm going to point to it and show an inconsistency there. Again, I take him at his word, but I'm going to show where his word elsewhere seems to be in conflict with this. Pope Francis, I would also add, clearly commissioned Fernandez to guard the deposit of faith, as Dr. Feser concedes. Thus, any talk of the DDF's magisterium being in suspense, even partially or temporarily, is absurd. Dr. Feser's article rests on the claim that the DDF's magisterium might be partially in suspense. See his concluding sentence, where he makes this claim by saying, quote, "If so, let us hope that this temporary suspense of the functions of the teaching church does not last 60 years as the previous one did," end quote. His claim here rests on his assertion that Pope Francis commissioned Fernandez not to correct doctrinal errors. Feser states, quote, "Taking all of Pope Francis's and Archbishop Fernandez's comments into account yields the following. Where it, the DDF, does address some such matter, it will not approach it by way of ferreting out doctrinal errors or imposing a single view," end quote. But Fernandez issued an interview shortly after my video and after Dr. Feser's CWR comment, Catholic World Report article, confirming my position and undermining Feser's thesis in the CWR article. Fernandez said, quote, "Look, if you read the Pope's letter carefully," I love how blunt he is. "Look, if you read the Pope's letter carefully," suggesting that people like Feser didn't do that. "If you read the Pope's letter carefully, it is clear that at no time does he say that the function of refuting errors should disappear. Obviously, if someone says that Jesus is not a real man or that all immigrants should be killed, that will require strong intervention," end quote. Thus, Dr. Feser was wrong to conclude from Pope Francis's letter that Fernandez was not charged with correcting error, and his suggestion of a temporary suspense of the DDF's magisterium under Fernandez, even if partial, is absurd. Now, I'm going to show you how absurd it is later on in the article when this comes up again, or later on in this video when this comes up again in this article. So more on that later. Now, next, Dr. Feser accuses me of engaging in a sleight of hand. But by the way, I mean, there are, I don't even know how many. There are dozens and dozens, if not 100, false accusations and derogatory comments, very condescending comments, slights against me all throughout his article. I only am commenting on some. He says I engage in a sleight of hand, which would mean that I'm being deceptive. This claim is false because the evidence for this accusation was just shown to be based on his misrepresentation of my response. So that's a false claim there. Dr. Feser then shifts to a discussion about Bellarmine and Cardinal Newman. Feser says that Newman approved of Athanasius and Jerome, who claimed Liberius temporarily subscribed to heresy. And Feser says that I made Feser sound, I didn't say it, but he says I made him sound like he got Newman wrong on this point. Now, I want to apologize to Dr. Feser if I came across as suggesting that Feser got Newman wrong on this point. Please forgive me. I'll note that Bellarmine also spoke approvingly of Athanasius and Jerome, who said Liberius subscribed to heresy. So now we're talking about Bellarmine, not Newman. I'm now mentioning Bellarmine. Bellarmine also, like Newman, spoke approvingly of Athanasius and Jerome, who said Liberius subscribed to heresy, but he later qualifies what this meant. Bellarmine says, now, someone will say, if that is so, then why does Jerome say that Liberius bent and subscribed to heresy in the end? I respond, although Liberius did not expressly consent to heresy, still he was interpreted. Bellarmine says he was interpreted as having done so, since he permitted Athanasius to be condemned, whom he knew suffered persecution for the sake of the faith. Therefore, this is what Jerome meant. So when they said he subscribed to heresy, they weren't actually saying that he expressly consented to heresy, but that he was interpreted this way. That's a per Bellarmine. Moreover, Bellarmine shortly after that says Liberius neither taught heresy nor was a heretic, and also notes that Sulpicius, Socrates, Sozomenus, and Nicephorus rejected the claim that Liberius subscribed to heresy. Bellarmine also notes Liberius did not expressly violate the faith and was under torture at the time of his alleged subscription. So this cannot be used as an instance of a suspense in the magisterium. Why am I belaboring this point? Well, here's why. However, Feser brings up Newman, so he brought up Newman on Liberius to show that Newman argued that this was an example of a temporary suspense of the function of the teaching church. Now, I initially cited Bellarmine above as a counter to Newman's claim, given that he neither taught heresy nor was his subscription voluntary, which means it was not a free teaching act. Thus, the subscription was not a consent to heresy. This seems to show that there was no suspense in the magisterium, as Newman seems to suggest. For this reason, I believe Newman was wrong on a temporary suspense of the magisterium in this example, and he's wrong upon the basis of what Bellarmine is arguing. And that's what I'm attempting to demonstrate. Now, Dr. Feser says, moreover, Bellarmine is neither infallible nor the final word among Catholic historians and on the matter. That is not to deny that Bellarmine, Lofton, and others have the right to defend Liberius against this charge. That is not the point. The point is rather that the matter is controversial and Catholics are at liberty to take either position. To which I say, I did not contest that Dr. Feser has the liberty to take another position. I only quoted Bellarmine because Dr. Feser quoted Newman, also not magisterial. And Bellarmine is arguably more compelling than Newman on this point. That's all. We don't have to make it something it's not. Dr. Feser says it is misleading for me to go on about Newman and Bellarmine on this point. Well, I just simply say I don't believe that this is the case, given that Bellarmine seems to overturn Newman's claim to a temporary suspense of the magisterium in this instance, which also undermines his very last sentence in the article. That is Feser's last sentence. Okay, Feser on non-infallible teachings. Dr. Feser says, in a passing remark about the nature of the magisterium, Lofton asserts that there is a protection and assistance of the Holy Spirit to non-infallible teachings as well, and that this is something I ought to address. And I'll point out, he doesn't seem to be aware of what I'm referring to. This isn't an assertion of mine. That is an assertion of Pope Pius XII in Humani Generis, among other places. Now, he goes on, if what Lofton has in mind here is the claim, which some have made, that even non-infallible exercises of the papal magisterium are somehow protected from error, then I have in fact argued elsewhere that this thesis is incoherent and not taught by the magisterium. That is not to say that such non-infallible teachings are not normally owed religious assent. They are owed, but this is a different matter. Well, this is obviously not what I had in mind. I mean, my doctoral dissertation is on this topic. This is obviously not what I'm maintaining for anybody who knows anything about me or bothers to do 5 minutes of research on me. Anybody who is familiar with my work, which Feser admits he's not, but could do a very quick Google search, would know that I grant that the Pope can teach error in his non-definitive teachings. I grant that. That's not in dispute here. And that is not what Pius XII means by an assistance of the Holy Spirit for non-infallible teachings. Clearly not. And I'll have to say, I'm already aware of Dr. Feser's article referenced here, the one that he points me to. I'm already aware of it. In fact, I've already responded to it in my video called Dr. Edward Feser and Papal Infallibility, a Friendly Response. So not only am I aware of the video or the article that he points me to, I've already responded to it. And then I understand Dr. Feser does not have the time to be aware of all my content. I get that. I totally get that. But Feser could have done a 5-second Google search to see if I had already responded to his article. If he had simply done so, he would have found it very quickly, and he would not have made this claim and muddied the waters. I'll point out, I don't think a person who misrepresents me this severely has sufficiently grappled with my interaction of their position and their content. I'm just going to throw that one out. If you misrepresent me this badly, repeatedly throughout the article, then, you might not be in the best position to respond to me at this moment. You might need to do a little bit more research. Because Dr. Feser's at a severe disadvantage here for multiple reasons. One of which is I'm very familiar with Feser's position. He is not familiar with mine. So already there's a disadvantage here. All right. So in reference to what I've raised about an assistance of the Holy Spirit to non-infallible teachings, again, which is Pius XII, among others, I'll note that Dr. Feser's article does not sufficiently account for what is meant by this magisterial concept. So the one he referred me to, the one that I've already responded to, that he doesn't realize I've already responded to, I'd say in this video, interestingly enough, this is where I believe Dr. Feser is not employing enough nuance, even though he accuses me of that. I'd have to respectfully say that about his position here. Here's why. Because, again, I'm familiar with his position, so here it is. Dr. Feser's position seems to be that one must either argue that all teachings of the Pope, even non-ex cathedra, are infallible, or one must admit that the Pope is capable of teaching heresy. Now, obviously, he takes the latter position. Now, he's not saying that the Pope has taught heresy. He's just saying that they are capable of teaching heresy. But for him, it's an either or. It's an either or, and I criticized that in the video, and I said, it's not an either or. There's a middle position here. As I've already demonstrated in response to Dr. Feser, there is a middle position here, namely that the Pope can err in his non-definitive teachings, yes, but that the grade of error cannot rise to the level of heresy. You see the difference? You see the difference? Feser thinks it's either you have to say that everything's infallible, or the Pope can teach heresy. And I'm saying, wait, there's a middle position. You don't have to say everything's infallible. Yes, some things can be in error, but there are levels and grades to error. With heresy at the very highest, we could assert a position that grants lower levels of error, but not the grade of heresy. Not that level of error. It's a third position. And this is what I meant when I was saying Dr. Feser ought to address this. Because I think it undermines some things that he says. The article referenced by Feser does not grapple with this middle position. It's not even on his radar in the article. If it's on his radar elsewhere, he's not showing any evidence of that in the article. And once again, for the record, I do believe the Pope can err in his non-definitive magisterium. My dissertation is on non-definitive errors, and especially the question of magisterial reversals. That already not only assumes the possibility of error, but I'm categorizing the kind of errors. I simply defend the thesis that the error will not rise to the theological grade of the censor of heresy. However, my middle position here is not even absolutely material to this discussion. It was kind of more of a, side note comment that I had. It's not really even material, absolutely speaking, to the discussion here on the suspense of the magisterium. So I'm not going to insist on it too strongly here. Now, Feser talks about his position on COVID vaccines next in the article. Dr. Feser says he has defended the moral lyceity of COVID vaccines as proof that he doesn't believe the magisterium of Pope Francis has been entirely suspended. I did not say that he believed that. I also clearly said that that was not his position. So to continue to assert this puts into doubt something that I didn't maintain. I specifically granted that this was the case. I did not attribute this to the position of Feser. I also applaud Dr. Feser's defense of the magisterium on this very difficult and unpopular position on COVID vaccines. The grief that he says he's received from traditional Catholics from this position is something I can certainly relate to. Of all people on YouTube, I can relate. All right. Dr. Feser says he has defended Pope Francis from the charge of heresy. I applaud this, and I ask people to take note of that. Those of y'all out there saying that Pope Francis has taught heresy, take note. Dr. Feser says that he's defended Pope Francis against that charge. However, I would ask him how that is consistent with his claim on August 3rd, 2018, where Feser wrote, however, on several issues, marriage and divorce, worthiness to receive Holy Communion, contraception, capital punishment, which he's elsewhere said, puts into question whether or not death penalty is intrinsically evil. And more, Pope Francis has repeatedly made statements that appear to contradict traditional Catholic teaching and has persistently refused to respond to respectful requests for clarification. Moreover, he has done so not only in offhand comments during interviews, but in official magisterial documents, such as Amoris Laetitia and now the Catechism. I wouldn't say that the Catechism is a magisterial document, but I get what he's saying. This is, to put it mildly, a highly unusual situation. These are not normal times in the church. To which I would say, is Feser of the opinion that if Pope Francis has really contradicted official magisterial in official magisterial documents, so is he of the opinion that if Pope Francis has really contradicted these things in official magisterial documents, then these errors, would they rise to the level of papal heresy in his non-definitive magisterium? Or would Dr. Feser grade these potential errors as lower than the grade of heresy? Now, if Dr. Feser would lower the grade of these errors, lower than heresy, can he explain why he believes these, quote, traditional Catholic teachings, end quote, are not dogmatic? Because that's what's assumed. If they're not heresy, then these aren't dogmas, because heresy is the censor that applies to the grade of the theological note of dogma. So if it's not heresy, then these aren't dogmas. So can we explain how traditional Catholic teaching in these areas, especially in light of what he said on the death penalty, is not dogmatic? Is he willing to defend the thesis that these potential errors are not violations of dogma? If not, then why bring up the point that he has defended Francis against the charge of heresy? And again, I'm just asking these questions for clarification. Now, Dr. Feser says it is true that, like many others, I have been critical of parts of Amoris Laetitia and the Pope's revision of the Catechism. But that is not because I do not regard these as magisterial acts. Rather, while they are magisterial acts, they exhibit deficiencies of the kind that Donum Veritatis acknowledges can exist in non-infallible magisterial statements. Lofton would presumably disagree with that judgment. But the point is that my own objections do not rest on the claim that the Pope has not exercised magisterial authority, end quote. This is becoming comical. Dr. Feser is so ignorant about my position that he is attributing to me, presumably, the most ridiculous positions that if anybody knows anything about me, they would be laughing at this. And in fact, people who read this were laughing because this is absurd. That is not my position. If you know anything about me, once again, I have not claimed that Feser maintains that the Pope has not exercised his magisterium in these cases authoritatively. That was never in dispute. I never put that in dispute. I'm familiar with Feser's work enough to know that that's not his position. I know that he believes it's authentic magisterium. I know that. I never put that in dispute. I know his position. However, Feser's at a disadvantage because he does not know my position. So while I'm familiar with his work, he's not familiar with mine. And that's totally understandable. That's completely understandable. I'm a nobody. Dr. Feser is a world-renowned international philosopher. It's totally understandable. He would not be familiar. But here's my point. If you're not familiar with somebody, don't be so quick to assume. Don't be quick to assume. Maybe do a Google search or just don't comment at all. If you don't want to do the Google search, you say, nah, I don't have enough time for that. Okay, then don't rush to your blog to comment. Just remain silent. That would be the wise thing to do if one can exercise restraints. Now, he accuses me later on at the end of a litany of accusations. It says that I'm effectively unrestrained, but I would point to this deficiency here on his part. Consequently, he suggests that I would presumably disagree that the Pope has exercised his magisterium, his authentic magisterium, in Amoris Laetitia. Obviously, that is not my position. Feser and I are in agreement here. We both believe it's authentic magisterium. However, where we may differ is whether the Pope has taught heresy in these magisterial documents. It's unclear to me. Does he believe that he taught heresy here? I don't know. I can see some things that make me think that he might take that position, and then again, he might not. It's unclear. But if Feser's answer is no, Pope Francis has not taught heresy in Amoris Laetitia, then I think he's going to have a pretty difficult time explaining that to traditional Catholics and the traditional Catholic community. I just saying. He's going to have a pretty difficult time. I certainly experience that whenever I defend that thesis. Now, if the answer is yes, and he believes that Pope Francis does teach heresy in his authentic magisterium, in Amoris Laetitia, then why did he mention that he has defended Francis from heresy earlier if he believes that the Pope may have taught heresy in Amoris Laetitia and other places? Why even bring that up? Why say I've defended Pope Francis against the accusation of heresy if you believe that he's taught heresy? And if you don't, okay, well, hey, good luck. Good luck defending that with the traditional Catholic community. I'm right there with you. I have to defend that thesis. And I take a whole lot of slander for it. Now, some comments here about Feser's agenda. And wrapping it up here. But I'm going to take a 5-minute break here, fill up my coffee, and then we'll continue. So yeah, let's give it about 5 minutes. Be right back. All right. Let's resume here. Share my screen. There we go. Okay. Kind of wrapping it up here. Concerning Feser's agenda, well, Dr. Feser says that I suggested he has a, quote, agenda in citing a CDF document instead of Amoris Laetitia. Now, I don't recall saying anything about an agenda in such a context. I don't remember that. I do remember something else, and I did a keyword search of the transcript, and the only result for the word agenda is when I was criticizing the following from Feser. I say, to be sure, there may nevertheless be particular cases where the suspended magisterium, or where he says, to be sure, there may be nevertheless particular cases where the suspended magisterium characterization is plausible. Consider the heated controversy that followed upon Amoris Laetitia, and in particular the dubia issued by 4 cardinals asking the Pope to reaffirm several points of irreformable doctrine that Amoris seems to conflict with, as Father Hunwick has noted. Because Pope Francis has persistently refused to answer these dubia, he can plausibly be said, at least to the extent that to have suspended the exercise of his magisterium. Again, this does not mean that he has lost his teaching authority. The point is rather that insofar as he has refused to answer these 5 specific questions put to him, he has not, at least with respect to those particular questions, actually exercised that authority. As Father Hunwick notes, he could do so at any time so that his teaching authority remains, end quote. I give you the whole quote so you know the context. I say, in reference to that, I say something about agenda. My point here is to say it's absurd to say that Pope Francis's magisterium on the matter of the point of the dubia has been suspended when 4 out of the 5 dubia were already clearly answered in Amoris and elsewhere. And then elsewhere, Pope Francis has sufficiently addressed the remaining dubia. Thus, there is no suspense on this point of his magisterium, because Amoris Laetitia is sufficiently clear on those points. I then note that it is odd that people continue to bring up the dubia. Now, note, I did not say Feser. I did not name Feser when I said this. And I wasn't even thinking of Feser on this point. I know who I was thinking of at the time, and I'm not naming them. In fact, I was thinking of someone else that I'm not going to mention here by name. But I know who I was thinking of, and it wasn't Feser. And I said this point then serves an agenda. And this agenda is to call the authority of Amoris Laetitia into suspense. And on the points of the 5 questions from the dubia, Feser does seemingly suggest that the magisterium may be in suspense. Now, that is his position, seemingly. I'm thinking of somebody else, but I'm just telling you, but that's also, it seems to be, Feser's position, again, on the question of the matters that relate to the dubia. Dr. Feser continues his derogatory and condescending tone by speaking of my fevered imagination concerning this agenda. Again, I could return the favor, but I'll pass. At the 19-minute, 40-second mark through 20-minute, 11 seconds timestamp, I say Francis hasn't suspended his magisterium, but I'm specifically speaking about Amoris Laetitia's magisterium. So I do say at that timestamp, Francis hasn't suspended his magisterium, but I'm specifically talking about Amoris Laetitia, the magisterium of Pope Francis concerning Amoris Laetitia. And at this point, I'm refuting those who would say the alleged lack of a response to the dubia has suspended on these points the teaching of Amoris. I was trying to express that the Pope does not have a suspended magisterium on these points, though Feser seems to suggest he does. So my criticism there may apply to Feser. In reality, I was actually thinking of someone else, not Feser, someone else who claims the dubia have not been answered. And I say of these people, these guys are not paying attention. I'm thinking of somebody else. I'm not even thinking of Feser here. Sadly, Feser interprets me as saying that he, Feser, doesn't believe Pope Francis has a magisterium at all. At all. He interprets me in that way when I was actually talking about somebody else, and I'm referring to their position on Pope Francis and Amoris Laetitia's magisterium specifically. Now, I believe if Feser had given me the judgment of charity, he would have understood I wasn't accusing him of maintaining the general suspended magisterium thesis, that all of Pope Francis's magisterium is suspended, since I explicitly said he doesn't hold that view. However, throw him a bone here. So throw him several, actually. However, I can't completely admit I could have been more clear here at this part of the video. I could have been more clear. And I think the confusion was actually due more to the way I sloppily communicated this point, more than due to Feser not giving me the benefit of the doubt. So I think the problem at this point, just at that point in the video, is more a fault with me than it was with Feser. When I went back and watched it, I was like, yeah, that's sloppy. I could have done better. And I could see if somebody's not giving me the judgment of charity, how they could conclude that. But I mean, I'll say, I think they should have given me the judgment of charity. Now, I think this caused a breakdown in communication and caused Feser to grossly misunderstand what I was criticizing. In part, I have some responsibility in that due to presenting that part poorly and not explicitly stating the identity of the people I was thinking about. In fact, I think the bulk of the confusion and breakdown in communication on this point is my fault, and I sincerely apologize for that. I do apologize. If I had worded this more carefully, which admittedly I would have in a written correspondence, then much of this confusion may have been avoided. May. However, I wish Feser would have given me the benefit of the doubt because I explicitly said he doesn't hold to the general suspense thesis. If he had given me the benefit of the doubt, then much of this confusion would have been avoided. Not just may, but would have. Now, there's a section here about the organs of the magisterium. It makes a big deal out of this because he says I made a big deal of it. Well, this is going to be a really interesting section here. Dr. Feser believes that I quibbled over his use of the term organs of the magisterium in reference to the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. Now, I am using the term organ to refer to the two agencies through which Christ acts. So Jesus, the two agencies through which Jesus teaches and acts. Dr. Feser clarifies in his follow-up that he is using the term organs of the magisterium to refer to the agency through which the Pope and the Church act. So there's a slight difference in the way we're using these terms. I'm using it to refer to the two agencies through which Jesus acts. He's using it to refer to the agencies through which the Pope and the Church, which I presume he means the bishops, act. I'll concede he used the term in a way that works given his definition. But I do think it is misleading to use that term of a congregation unless it has been assigned indefinite magisterial status by the Pope, or it refers merely to the congregation in instances that have been approved in common form or specific form. But given that many people aren't aware of these qualifications, the term organ of the magisterium for a congregation can be misleading and give people the impression that the congregations can teach by their own authority without papal approbation. Now, he doesn't believe that they can. He rightly notes that no, they have to have papal approbation. He knows that. So he makes the proper qualifications, but I'm just saying it can be misleading because a lot of people aren't going to pick up on all these qualifications. If he doesn't agree that the way he uses the term in this instance can be misleading, then I'm happy to agree to disagree on this point. This point isn't a hill to die on, given his qualifications are they are sufficient for the way in which he's using the term. I don't think it's the best, but it's not a hill for me to die on. Now, he's going to present it as I'm trying to die on this hill. Actually, it was something else that it was a hill I'm dying on, and I'm going to address that here in a moment, so just wait. Now, Dr. Feser appeals to his use of the term organ for the congregation by noting that Paul VI restructured the biblical commission so that it is no longer an organ of the magisterium. I'm well aware of this, painfully aware of it. But I'll note that in the case of the biblical commission, until that time, it possessed an indefinite assignment as an extension of the papal magisterial organ. Such is not the case with the DDF. It does not have an indefinite assignment. It has to explicitly be approved, either in common form or specific form. For this reason, I would just simply avoid that term. Now, if he wants to say, well, no, I think it's a legitimate use of that term, that's fine. That's fine. I'm happy to agree to disagree on this point. I'm telling you why I don't think it's the best. I think it can cause confusion there. But if you disagree, that's fine. Dr. Feser says that the biblical commission as an organ falsifies my claim that only the Pope and College of Bishops are properly called magisterial organs. To this, I'd simply note that the biblical commission was given this mission as an extension of the papal magisterial organ, not a separate organ. That's really all I was establishing. But I am aware that some people have used Ratzinger and Dulles. I'm aware that some people have used this kind of language in reference to congregations, specifically when they're approved by the Pope. But for the reason why I just noted, I don't know if that's the best use of the term. But I'm happy to agree to disagree. It's not a hill to die on. Dr. Feser says, it also wouldn't make sense to call other modes by which the Pope teaches encyclicals, for example, or sermons, organs of the church, for they are not agencies in the sense in which the DDF is an agency. Issuing an encyclical or giving a sermon is an action that the Pope carries out, not an organ. Granted, I'll note. I grant that. I haven't argued to the contrary. I did not know that was in dispute. I don't know why this is being brought up. I haven't argued to the contrary, as I follow Dr. Joy in distinguishing between subject, object, and act when it comes to the magisterium. I agree, organ pertains to a subject, and the medium through which the Pope teaches, or the subject teaches, may follow or fall under act. There's no dispute here. I'm aware of these distinctions. I agree with them. However, I did make a big deal out of this point. The pink elephant in the room that Feser doesn't address is not only that Feser called the DDF an organ of the magisterium. That's something I'm willing to say, fine, not a hill to die on, whatever. The major concern of mine in the video was when he twice called the DDF not just an organ, but the main magisterial organ of the church. Keyword main, not keyword organ. I quibbled a little with the term organ, but my bigger concern was with main. Moreover, I'm especially concerned that he says, quote, that this, well, the DDF's, he says, quote, main magisterial organ of the church will largely no longer be exercising its magisterial function. He suggests this might be the case, that the DDF, he says, is the main magisterial organ of the church, and this main magisterial organ of the church under Fernandez will largely no longer be exercising its magisterial function. I made a big deal out of that. Now, he presents me as making a big deal out of just the term organ. It wasn't so much the term organ that I'm making a big deal out of, although I did quibble a little over it. It was more out of that claim, the main magisterial organ, and that this main magisterial organ of the church will no longer be exercising its magisterial function. Yeah, that caused an issue for me. And still does. Why? Well, this gives people the impression that the magisterium will be significantly reduced in output, given that the DDF has allegedly been the main magisterial organ of the church. And I already said that in the video. I already explained all that in the video. This is why I labored in the video to note that Pope Francis teaches weekly, and that Francis ordinarily teaches directly, and that the DDF, in fact, is not the common way in which the Pope teaches. Now, wait, he says it's the main, up until this point, the DDF has been the main magisterial organ of the church. And I'm going to say, what? That doesn't make sense. The main way in which the Pope teaches is directly and vicariously or indirectly through congregations is more rare. How can we say that that's a main magisterial organ or has functioned as the main magisterial organ up until that time when that's just not the case? In fact, it is not the common way in which the Pope teaches. I belabored this point. This does not seem to have been sufficiently accounted for by Feser in his response to me. He did not really interact with this. You know what he did? He got hung up on the question of, can he use the term organ to refer to the DDF? A point of which, again, I contested to an extent, but he focused on that and did not address the other description, the other adjective, the big issue, the main point, which is the claim that it's the main magisterial organ. He did not grapple with that in his response to me. He doesn't address that. He unfortunately sidesteps it and focuses on a smaller issue, and then presents me as focusing only on that small issue when in reality, that wasn't my biggest concern. So he presents me as making a huge deal out of something small, but in reality, that is not what I was making a big deal out of. It was not sufficiently accounted for on his part. And it still causes one to be concerned. Because despite his clarifications, Feser believes the suspense of the papal magisterium will be significantly reduced under Fernandez. He says that. He tries to clarify it in his follow-up to me. He tries to limit it and says that, oh, it was limited all along. Okay. But that doesn't really explain this part, where he twice says it's a main magisterial organ and has been the main magisterial organ up until that point. And under Fernandez, the main magisterial organ of the church, the DDF, will largely no longer be exercising its magisterial function. That's going to give the people the impression that a large part of the magisterium is no longer going to be functioning. Again, he can say, oh, no, I don't believe that. But what you're saying here lends a person to that. So it's contradicting what you're saying elsewhere. And he did not sufficiently account for that internal inconsistency, or at least seemingly internal inconsistency. He did not account for it. He did not explain it. Now, in his response to me, Dr. Feser says, now, in my article, I also refer to the CDF or DDF as the main magisterial organ of the church. Now, note, he uses the term main there, but watch what he does. And Lofton reacts as if it were somehow especially suspect. Indeed, he calls it jaw-dropping error and reiterates his claim that it is not an organ. It's inappropriate to call it an organ, and it's not the primary mode or means by which the Pope teaches. Notice that. Notice that. Notice that. I'm not just saying that it's inappropriate to call it an organ. I am saying that. Again, not okay, fine, not a hill to die on, but it's that second part. It's not the primary mode or means by which the Pope teaches. And he said twice that up until that point, it has been, and now under Fernandez, it's not going to be. And he says, I'm making a big deal out of it, and I say it's a jaw-dropping error. However, what I thought was the jaw-dropping error wasn't merely the claim that we can call the DDF an organ. It's not a jaw-dropping error in the way in which he's using the term fine. The big error, seemingly, in my opinion, was that he said, again, the main magisterial organ of the church, the DDF. And I just thought that's just so absurd. This does seem to be jaw-dropping. I'm not sure why Feser didn't sufficiently respond to my criticisms on this point. Instead, he focused merely on the organ terminology dispute. My bigger concern is the part about the DDF being the main magisterial organ of the church, by the way. Not just of the Pope, of the church. That's a pretty major claim. Again, it's not just of the papal magisterium, it's of the church, which he uses that to refer to the College of Bishops. Again, which Feser did not account for. Instead, he goes on a long rant about the wrong thing. And I'm just left wondering, okay, all right, so we can agree to disagree on the organ issue. All right, but what about this whole other business about the main magisterial organ? He quotes himself as having said that, and he doesn't address it. Now, Dr. Feser's last sentence in the article, the CWR article that initiated all this, Dr. Feser's last paragraph from the CWR article says, the implications of these recent remarks are accordingly quite dramatic, and while it is possible that the remarks will be clarified and qualified, these are the remarks of Pope Francis. After Archbishop Fernandez takes office, the trend of Francis's pontificate is precisely one of avoiding the clarification and qualification of theologically problematic statements. But whereas in the past this avoidance pertained to a handful of specific issues, it now seems as if it is being raised to the level of the general DDF policy. If so, let us hope that this temporary suspense of the functions of the teaching church does not last 60 years as the previous one did. St. John Henry Newman, pray for us. Pay attention to that. He is advocating for a limited version, at least potentially, of the DDF under Fernandez. A limited suspense of the magisterium, potentially, under Fernandez at the DDF. Dr. Feser repeatedly gave the impression, however, that I claimed he was saying the whole magisterium is in suspense. As I noted before, I showed that I explicitly said otherwise in the video. I even gave the timestamp. I also know that his last sentence about a suspense of the magisterium is specifically in reference to the DDF under Fernandez. In light of Feser's interpretation of Francis's letter to Fernandez, I explicitly noted all of that in the video. But he constantly presented me all throughout the article as presenting him as offering this general presentation and this general suspense of the magisterium. Constantly presented me in that way, as if I was mischaracterizing him, despite me saying he doesn't believe that, despite all of the necessary qualifications. Yes, at one point in the video, I could have been more clear, But elsewhere, I was clear enough. And with the judgment of charity, this would have been avoided on his part. Now, in his response to me, Dr. Feser explains that his last sentence in the CWR article is merely in reference to a partial, he says, and not a complete suspense of the DDF's magisterium. And notice we're talking about the DDF specifically. And it's partial in nature, not even complete. So he's saying, I don't think that there's going to be some complete suspense of the DDF. I'm just saying it's partial. Well, I didn't catch the partial part in the CWR article, but this is what he's saying in his response to me, that he was saying it was partial. Okay, I'm going to have to take him at his word since he tells me that's what it is. And again, I'm going to take him at his word, even though he doesn't do that with me. So I appreciate the clarification, as I really was getting the impression that he was suggesting a complete suspense of the DDF's magisterium under Fernandez. I really was getting that impression. Now, if that's not his position, okay, cool. I appreciate the clarification. However, there's some unanswered questions here. However, I already anticipated this potential and extremely qualified meaning on Feser's part. I already realized maybe this is his position. I already anticipated it. And so I even criticized, well, if that's his position, I even criticized it in the video, which he did not account for. And so I'm going to repeat my criticisms of that here. If that is what Dr. Feser was trying to argue in the article, the CWR article, then it was a waste of everybody's time. He wasted all of our time. This kind of thesis, this thesis is practically useless. And I wonder how such a claim is even productive. But what was the even point of wasting our time with such a limited and qualified definition of a suspense of the magisterium potentially under Fernandez? It seems useless. It seems like a waste of our time. It would be similar to me saying the Pope's magisterium is in a state of suspense when he eats breakfast, since he's not actively teaching in that moment. And I write a whole long article about it in CWR. This very qualified sense of a suspended magisterium is technically true. Yeah, it's true that while he's eating his donut, he's not teaching at that moment. I guess we could say there's a suspense in the magisterium. But it's practically useless to assert this. And it would be quite absurd to make an entire article about it. And given that Archbishop Fernandez already clarified right after this, and certainly the clarification was made before he responded to me, he made it clear in his pillar interview that the DDF is still going to refute error, which again undermines severely Feser's argument in CWR. So what are we really talking about? Well, at most, Dr. Feser could say that the DDF will correct error less under Fernandez than before. Okay, I could maybe see that. Is Fernandez going to correct error less than his predecessor? Maybe. I could see that. But that's not the claim. But a partial suspense in the DDF's magisterium in light of this is analogous to talk about a suspense in the papal magisterium when the Pope uses the restroom or clips his toenails. What? This felt like a huge waste of people's time. If this is the qualified sense in which we mean. Now, he says, and I'm going to have to take him at his word, he says that's all he was, and he wasn't even saying that's going to happen. He was just saying that this could potentially be the case under Fernandez. This very limited suspense. To which I now need to ask, all right, well, what was really accomplished here by Dr. Feser? What was really accomplished in this article? To demonstrate that there may be a partial temporary suspense in the DDF's magisterium when Fernandez doesn't correct error? What is one accomplished by arguing such a limited claim? I have to ask the question, is this a hot take? People would clearly see suspended magisterium and Fernandez in the title of the article that Feser wrote, and they're going to rush to click on it. But when they get to the end of the article, Feser lets all the air out of the balloon and merely wants them to conclude that there may be a temporary suspense of the DDS magisterium when Fernandez doesn't correct error, which analogously amounts to saying there's a suspense in the papal magisterium when the Pope sleeps at night. What did readers really gain from this article? How is this not a hot take that Feser despises? Or was it that Dr. Feser did intend to convey that the main magisterial organ will largely no longer be exercising its magisterial function and only walked back these claims in his response to me after Fernandez released his interview and after I offered my criticism? Now, I will take Feser at his word, but he has not sufficiently explained this point, and it really does not seem to add up to me. I'm not saying he's lying. I am not saying that he changed his position after Fernandez and after I criticized it. But I'm saying if that was his interpretation, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. If that's originally what he was trying to communicate, I should say. If that was his intention, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense, and it doesn't account for what he said elsewhere about the main magisterial organ being effectively, largely suspended or in suspense. After this, wrapping it up, Dr. Feser proceeds to accuse me of intellectual dishonesty due to a comment I made about an agenda. But as I've shown earlier, the reference to an agenda has nothing to do with what Dr. Feser says necessitates intellectual dishonesty on my part, so it's just another act of defamation on his part. Next, Feser says I'm a self-appointed defender of Pope Francis. Well, as a professional apologist, it's my duty to defend the church, which includes the successor of St. Peter, from false accusations. However, I will not defend him from error or valid criticisms. As far as papal criticism, Dr. Feser then shifts to this topic and says, if it was legitimate for the Nouvelle Théologie writers, respectfully, to criticize the shortcomings they claim to see in the magisterium of their day, then it cannot be denied that it can be legitimate, respectfully, to criticize the shortcomings some see in Pope Francis's magisterium. To which I say, amen, Dr. Feser. I affirm that one can criticize the Pope. Canon 212, Dona Veritatis, I've mentioned them numerous times on this show. I offer criticisms of Pope Francis weekly, if not daily. But this is yet another example where Pope Feser, I said Pope Feser, that's funny. Dr. Feser doesn't really know a whole lot about my position on the Pope. And again, I would recommend that if one does not know much about the person they're responding to, they ought to avoid commenting on them and their position until they're better informed, lest they might be guilty of defamation and hot takes. Lastly, trash talk. Dr. Feser accuses me of trash talk when I noted in a comment section, not even in the article, not even in a video, in a comment section, I noted that Dr. Feser should stick to philosophy, which is his area of expertise. Dr. Feser says that training in philosophy is a prerequisite to doing theology. I don't dispute this. My concern is that one's training in philosophy, or even theology in general, does not necessarily prepare one for an in-depth discussion on the magisterium. I'll note that Dr. Feser engaged in trash talk in his response to me more times than I can count. So it seems odd that he would latch on to the one comment I made, despite acts of this nature on his part, including defamation. Examples at the end of the article that Feser gives, and again, the whole article is laced with a litany of slanderous, defamatory accusations against me, condescending language all over the place. The end of the article gives some interesting ones, though. He includes that I'm lacking in intellectual discipline. Dr. Feser says, I'm lacking in intellectual discipline. I'm lacking in the ability to use precise wording. I'm lacking in the ability to make careful conceptual distinctions. I'm lacking in the ability to use reason and logic. Okay. I'm lacking in the ability to evaluate texts. And I'm lacking in the ability to employ caution, and keyword, lacking in the ability to employ charity. Dr. Feser says, I'm not charitable. I'll simply note from this, it's apparent Dr. Feser doesn't know what he's talking about. And he's rashly engaging in trash talk without carefully evaluating my work and without carefully considering my position by cautiously employing reason, logic, and charity. However, 2 wrongs, or over 100 wrongs on Feser's part, don't make a right. I apologize for the way in which I expressed that comment in the instance above when I said that he should stick to philosophy. I apologize for the way in which I expressed that. I do maintain that most people should generally stick to their own expertise in areas that can significantly impact the fate of souls, as the subject of the magisterium and papal error can certainly do. Is this the case with Dr. Feser? Should he stick to philosophy, or should he continue to delve into the question of the magisterium? Well, you decide. You decide that. Lastly here, is continuing this conversation productive after this video? Because I'm pretty much done with this presentation. Is continuing this conversation with Dr. Feser productive? In light of what I've seen for Dr. Feser's blog response, Feser's formula, which we saw earlier with his acts of defamation, and Feser's poisoning of the well, I'm uncertain whether further interaction will be productive, as it seems it may perpetuate a never-ending cycle of false accusations from Dr. Feser. Sadly, rather than Dr. Feser and I sparring together over the theological issues, Dr. Feser has made the discussion personal by misinterpreting my motives and then accusing me of libel, and then going through a very long series of adding more defamatory accusations when corrected. I have a few requests if we're going to consider future dialogue. If he is interested, which he probably is not, but I don't want to speak for him. If he's ever interested in maybe dialogue with me, I have a few requests I'd like for him to consider. Feser is welcome to consider retracting defamatory and uncharitable claims made about me. Examples include, but are not limited to, that I engaged in libel, that I defamed him for clicks, that I have a psychological condition, that I'm unwilling to admit when I'm wrong, that I'm not honest, and so on and so forth. That's it. I hope this was productive. Hope it was helpful. Again, not exactly sure about the future of discussions here. If Feser comments on the magisterium, generally speaking, I might interact with it. But as far as discussions between he and I, if he's even interested, I think that there's some things that we need to. I think there's some things we need to consider doing before maybe continuing in light of what I've seen so far. But I wanted to offer this because, there's a very interesting quote from Scripture that comes to mind. I'll provide it to you here. Let's see. It's going to be Proverbs 18:17. Share my screen. I responded to Dr. Feser here because Proverbs 18:17 comes to mind. In a lawsuit, the first to speak seems right until someone comes forward and cross-examines. And how many times is that the case, right? So-and-so's story sounds right. You hear maybe of a divorce, you hear one side of the story, sounds right until you meet the other person. You're like, oh, all right, well, they kind of left out that detail. That kind of changes the whole thing. You get a very different side, right? And there were a lot of people who read Feser's article and they were just thinking, oh, wow. I mean, he's just bringing up some really good points about you, Michael. And I thought, I'm not so sure. There was a few points that I concede there, but they're minor points that I've conceded. There were no major points that I was required to concede. And in fact, I do think that there's some pretty major points he did not engage. Although you see, I very thoroughly addressed his 5,100 word article nearly line by line, whereas he did not necessarily do that with my video, and that's okay. But I thoroughly addressed his response. And I want to say, while I have some concessions, they're pretty minor overall. Whereas, again, the more major criticisms that I offered, I don't think he really sufficiently grappled with. And so I had a little bit of a different impression when I read his article. I didn't think, oh, wow, this is really substantive and this really overturns what I said. I thought, I'm seeing a lot of concerns and problems here, which, again, I've expressed here. And so, again, in a lawsuit, the first to speak seems right. It's going to seem convincing. And then until somebody comes and cross-examines and says, yeah, you know what? Not so clear cut. So anyways, hope this was helpful. I don't know if he's going to respond. If he responds with slander, acts of defamation, Twitter, blog, whatever, I'm not going to respond to those. I generally do not respond to defamatory comments. I receive them hourly, every single day, dozens of times a day by many people. I respond to maybe 1% of the comments made about me, if that. In Dr. Feser's case, I responded because he's a man of, great stature, academically, philosophically. So for him to make defamatory comments, I thought, no, I need to address this at least once. If he continues to defame me, you know what? That's on him at that point. I have this video, and people can kind of see maybe the difference, and can kind of see where I'm coming from and what my response is. So don't expect me to respond to anything else that he comes out with if he decides to accuse me of anything after this. And again, if he decides to interact with the content itself, again, see my last slide where I kind of give my thoughts on what we'll do at that point. But I'm not exactly sure. He might just not even respond at all. And okay, that's fine. He's certainly not required to. I do think he's required to retract the defamation, but certainly not required to respond to my theological points of contention. But that's going to be it, y'all. I hope this was helpful. If it was, hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, share this on your social media. Let me know your thoughts there in the comment section. And hey, let's pray that there's a peaceful resolution to this, and that we would glorify Christ in our ways that we handle this situation moving forward. But that's going to do it, y'all. Again, hit the like button, subscribe button, patreon.com/reason and theology if you want to support me. God bless.
Are you confused about how Catholic teaching authority works? With encyclicals, papal bulls, councils, and many other things, it's easy to get confused on what is authoritative and what is not. Fortunately, at maximusinstitute.com, I have prepared a course explaining the magisterium from A to Z. Visit the website and check out the course Understanding the Magisterium for more information.
Hey everybody, just wanted to tell you about my new free ebook, Church Chaos, Biblical Insights for Confused Catholics. If you are a confused Catholic and you're thinking about leaving the Catholic Church, or you're thinking about converting to the church, but you see that there's a crisis in the church and you're just unsure, this is the book for you. Again, it is free. Just simply go to reasonandtheology.com. You'll see a pop-up that comes up on your screen. Just simply click on it and you'll put in your email and it will provide you the free PDF ebook right then and there. Please check it out if you're confused about the situation in the Catholic Church today. reasonandtheology.com. Hey, pro-lifers, I want to remind you about realestateforlife.org. If you want to support the pro-life movement at no cost to you in the process of buying a home or selling a home, office, or any kind of property anywhere in the world, check out realestateforlife.org for more information. God bless. Hey, thanks for watching. Don't forget to hit the like button and the subscribe button. See you next time. God bless.